Welcome everyone. We're going to give about another minute to let folks trickle in and get logged into the webinar. So, all right, we still have okay, I think we can go ahead and get started now. Good afternoon. Welcome to the Energy Communities Alliance Winter Webinar Series. My name is Jennifer Chandler, and I am moderating this session from Piketon, Ohio. We have nice weather and a little sunshine today. I want to start by saying thank you to the DOE Office of Nuclear Energy for supporting Energy Communities Alliance webinars, which support local communities like Piketon and Oak Ridge and others who are interested in hosting nuclear facilities. So thank you so much for your support. Today's webinar is co-location options with nuclear storage. We're going to explore how thoughtful co-location strategies can balance innovation with safety and public trust in the next generation of nuclear infrastructure. I'm going to introduce the speakers one at a time here in a minute, but the goal for our session today is to help local leaders have a better understanding of reprocessing and the option to co-locate consolidated storage of the nuclear materials with the new technologies within their communities by hearing from our four amazing panelists who are experts in their fields. You will also be able to submit questions through the chat for our panelists toward the end of the discussion as well. And so I'm going to introduce our speakers here, and each will take about 5 minutes to do an introduction to their role in this process. So the first we have Dr. Jennifer Schaefer. She's the Associate Director for Technology and the Program Director for ARPA-E. Dr. Schaefer?
All right, thank you so much, Jennifer, for that introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. It looks like we have 108 attendees, which is just awesome to learn more about nuclear fuel recycling technologies, some of which I note on the call I actually know quite a bit about nuclear fuel recycling technologies, right? But as she said, I'm Jennifer Schaefer. I'm the Associate Director of Technology for ARPA-E, and I serve as a program director for the Curie program, which is a program focused on nuclear fuel recycling technologies. For those of you that are less familiar with ARPA-E, ARPA-E is designed to be a high turnover agency, actually. So you come to the agency with the expectation that you might only serve for a 3 to 5 year period and hopefully make a significant impact in a field. And prior to my time at ARPA-E, and actually concurrently in my time, I've been a professor at Colorado School of Mines, where I've had an expertise in nuclear fuel recycling technologies, and so that's my technical background. When I came to the organization, to the agency, one of the things that I had seen in the landscape of recycling technologies was that while we are certainly technically capable of recycling, and we have seen this time and time again in various countries, including our own, with respect to us, but in particular solvent extraction technologies, which is where my technical background sits, but also other means of recycling. It seemed that, courtesy of the way the US was structured in its approach to nuclear fuel recycling, we hadn't been able to have a consistent commitment to the technology to the point that we could really deploy it and utilize it. And that was something that I was quite focused on trying to resolve using technology to address that. Some of the key matters that I realized was that, one, when it comes to recycling technologies themselves, consistently at the way that we have the technology developed and deployed right now, it is a more expensive technology than using fresh uranium fuel, right? So even if we were to deploy a recycling facility in the US, prior to me coming to RPE, these were going to be technologies that would always have to compete with uranium, fresh uranium on the market, and this would make for just a challenge in our system. If you go to a country like France, where they have elected to, as a country, recycle and also provide the right economic framework for all of this to make sense for them, then you can end up in a different scenario. And so, from that perspective, I felt that we needed to go back to the drawing board and reassess what chemistries, technologies had advanced over the course of what it's been basically 70 years since we've discovered plutonium, and see, what we might go to differently. Because originally, when we developed some of the technologies that are currently in use, they were not designed for economics, they were designed for making pure plutonium streams. And that actually gets to another concern that I had noticed, was that the technologies that we were using were used for pure plutonium stream production. And this is something that had been a consistent challenge for the US because of the nonproliferation concerns that many stakeholders had. But also, in an emergent sense, we knew that separation technologies didn't have to generate pure plutonium streams. And so it seemed very timely to go back and trying to design systems that accounted for the economics of the process, to try and drive it towards the cost of fresh uranium fuel, to design processes that would actually co-recover actinides, in particular plutonium, so that you could minimize the proliferation risk associated with that, as well as leverage significant advances in digital technologies that had come online that were being leveraged by other chemical processing entities like the oil and gas industry, which can significantly improve the operational uptime as well as the monitoring of their processes. And so, obviously, these are all things that I could speak to much more, but I want to make sure that I leave time for the other panelists to introduce themselves, and I look forward to talking with you all more about it over the hour.
Thank you so much. Yeah, we'll definitely be coming back around on some of the points you raised in your introduction. Definitely great topics. Next is Randy Heeman, and he is the city manager for the city of Oak Ridge, who is leading our nuclear resurgence. Randy?
Thank you, Jennifer. I'm Randy Heeman. I'm the non-technical person, I guess, on the panel today. I have been city manager here in Oak Ridge for about 2 years. I appreciate the opportunity to participate in this session today because, it's going to ask and talk about some of the important questions about how do we move from national energy policy priorities to actual enactment and implementation at the grassroots level, the local level. So, for us, it's an exciting time, but it's also a challenging time as we deal with changing technologies, different technologies, and a changing and developing regulatory framework. So everybody that's associated with energy communities, we all operate in what I would consider a unique political and physical environment in most of our communities. In Oak Ridge, just to give you a little background, I've got a city council that I work with where I've got a city council person that is involved on the environmental side. I've got a person who was at one time involved in processing and enrichment. I've got another city council person that is on the security side. I've got a council person who's now the chair of ECA. And then I've got a pastor, but he's got a chemistry background. So I've got a group of folks that all understand a fair amount about what's going on with new nuclear. And on top of that, obviously, we've got the Y12 plant here. We've got ORNL, the Oak Ridge National Lab, which you'll hear from Dr. Pointer in a minute. But we have a community that's educated in nuclear and very accepting of nuclear. But that also, from a political standpoint, means that our folks know and understand, and they ask a lot of very interesting and good questions when companies come to town. One of our city council people, for instance, when Oklo came to look at us, I'm sure they never would have dreamed that we had a person who had actually designed a fuel reprocessing center years ago sitting on city council, asking a lot of interesting questions. In the last 2 years, we have gone from a few companies operating here to a handful that are now coming out of the ground. When you look at Kairos, TriSoX, BWXT, and Centrus has been here with us, and we've now got a really good connection with Centrus and Piketon, Ohio. Centrifuges will be made here and shipped up there where they'll be used. But we've got Standard Nuclear, we've got a number of companies. So in last July, Department of Energy selected us as one of the 4 sites to move forward with plans for inviting public sector or private sector partners to develop AI data centers and energy generation projects. We participated in that day meeting with DOE in October and answered questions about infrastructure and development process because unlike a lot of energy communities, 100% of what goes on in our community is within our city limits. So that's one way we're slightly different, I think, than some other folks. So we participated in that, but like I said, our 90 square mile city limits includes all of the land that's under consideration for all of these projects. So I would like to make it clear that our community is not seeking to co-locate a spent fuel storage site. We are, however, looking at things like conducting a systematic review of our emergency response, infrastructure capabilities, all the things that we need to do as these companies continue to come out of the ground and expand, and we get new companies. So we're also working on creating and maintaining a sustainable financial framework to support the industry as we look at what is coming in and what kind of investments will we as a city have to make in order to support the things that are coming in. On the regulatory side, I'll quickly just say that we're working on a nuclear zoning district for our zoning ordinance as a result of the fact that that's been placed previously in our heaviest zoning category, which has some things in it that are things that we don't want to rezone a lot of property for that. And many of our nuclear businesses are cleaner than the things that would typically go in that industrial category. So we're trying to figure out a way to do an overlay district to make it, from a regulatory standpoint, easier for them to get in and operate, and also keep us from getting heavy industrial things that we might not want in certain locations. So we're also looking at industrial parks and sites to accommodate industries, dealing with things that we hadn't thought about before, as for example, should we have a private road network so that folks don't have to get permits from authorities because it's on a private road when it goes from the fuel processor that's at the top of the industrial park down to a person who's going to be using it at the bottom of the park. So we're working on all those things as well. So exciting times in Oak Ridge and for many of our communities that are working on these projects. And I look forward to continuing the conversation.
Yeah, that was great, Randy, and very exciting. I know in Piketon, we are working on those same exact things with the zoning overlays and just trying to make things just a little bit more convenient and certainly single points of contact for project sponsors. So, thank you for that. Our next panelist is Dr. David Pointer. He's the Director, Nuclear Energy and Fuel Cycle Division at the Oak Ridge National Labs.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you for the initial introduction, Randy. It's always good to see you. I currently lead the core group of our fission team at the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. and have worked for the last 25 years in the Department of Energy's research programs focused on nuclear energy and fuel cycles. I spent 12 years at Argonne National Laboratory before I came here in 2012. I've had the opportunity to contribute to all of the flavors of reactors and fuels that are currently under consideration in that time, um, in those research programs. It's been very exciting. So it's really exciting to hear in East Tennessee, as part of this exciting environment where some of those things are starting to become a reality. You know, at the laboratory, we often talk about our origins and how in 1943 a group of scientists approached the leadership of the Manhattan Project, um, and we really were there to convince them that we needed to make an investment in an additional scientific step as part of the development of plutonium production capability in that program, and build a demonstration reactor that would allow us to learn how to continuously operate facilities. We had successfully operated or completed 2 experiments in Chicago with the 2 critical piles, and proven that fission could be managed and could occur in a managed way. Um, but we hadn't shown that you could operate real industrial facilities. And so the Manhattan Project leadership agreed, but they demanded that they deliver that facility within a year so that it wouldn't impact the schedule of the overall project. Um, and they came back and they started construction in April. They finished the design for the facility at the end of April. And it was turned over from construction to operations at the end of July. They achieved their first criticality, their first real operating day, on November 4th. And so in a 9-month period, they went from concept to something that was up and running. And we often focus on that reactor, as being the originating point for the laboratory. But we always gloss over the fact that it also included the nation's first fuel cycle facility, um, and the ability to extract plutonium um, as part of the mission of the program. And so it's important for us, I think, to remember that these aren't new technologies. We've been working to develop them steadily for 80 years. Um, and Jen gave you some of that history, in her introductory remarks, so I won't repeat them. Um, but I think it's important that we recognize that legacy. We also have to recognize that we're in a really strange position at this point in time. For the last 30 years, we have been coasting on the infrastructure that we have. The U.S. nuclear power plants operating today produce 60% more energy than they did in 1990, which is just a staggering number. And engineering advancements and R&D have allowed all of our energy production methods to see similar gains. So that across the board, hydro, fossil fuels, wind, solar, everything produces significantly more energy than we were capable of producing just 30 years ago. But we're at the end of that rope. We have extracted all of the additional efficiency from those systems that really we can. And so we're faced with the challenge of building a next generation of facilities, a new set of infrastructure to support the energy needs of the nation. And if we believe the projections, that look at energy use in this country, the combination of electrification of industry and the introduction of data centers really introduces an enormous shift in the electrical demand within the United States. And if we believe the current projections, we may need to double our production capacity within the next 25 years, which is a staggering challenge. And that's why we're finding ourselves in this conversation today about how do we quickly get new nuclear technologies off the ground and onto the grid, so that they're having an impact on our ability to deliver the energy required for industry to operate, for residential consumers to have confidence in their heat and power and electric power for all their devices, and continue to allow the U.S. economy to grow as we have for the last 30 years, as we've extracted this additional capacity. The fuel cycle is a really critical piece for the successful deployment of nuclear technologies. In that same 30 years, we've been able to largely meet our needs for uranium with existing stockpiles. And we're also at the end of that rope. which is why you see the Department of Energy's focus on supporting the development of facilities that allow for enrichment, provide a domestic supply of enriched uranium, trying to establish a conversion capability. How do we convert that typically gaseous form of uranium back to something that can be made into fuel in a chemical facility? And starting to think about the back end after we've used the fuel. How do we recover the valuable isotopes and critical materials and unused fuel from the used fuel that comes out of the back end of a reactor operation cycle? That's why we're having this conversation today. I look forward to to this discussion, and I hope to hear some great questions from the audience as part of this too. So, thanks for the opportunity to join you.
Thank you so much. Yeah, you definitely pointed out some big goals that we have as a nation to meet these power demands, especially with these data centers that are popping up everywhere. So thank you so much, Dr. Pointer. Next is Michelle Sampson, Director of the Division of New and Renewed Licenses at the Office of Nuclear Reactor Regulation at the NRC.
Thanks so much. And I appreciate the opportunity to be here. As the director of the Division of New and Renewed Licenses, my organization is responsible for licensing new nuclear reactors and other technologies around the traditional light water reactor types of fuel. NRC's focus is on the safety and security of commercial uses of nuclear materials through efficient licensing, oversight, and regulatory processes. Our mission statement is to protect public health and safety and advance the nation's common defense and security by enabling the safe and secure deployment of civilian nuclear energy technologies and radioactive materials for the benefit of society and the environment. For today's panel, I'm here to talk about our licensing processes as it would relate to recycling or reprocessing operations. Reprocessing or fuel recycling, there's been a little bit of discussion about it from our previous panelists, but it refers generally to the processes used to separate spent nuclear reactor fuel into nuclear materials that may be recycled for use in new fuel and to reduce the total volume of material that would be discarded as waste. There are currently no commercial reprocessing facilities operating in the United States, but there are commercial facilities operating in other countries. By way of a little history, the NRC's predecessor, AEC, permitted the West Valley Demonstration Project, which operated from 1966 until 1972. Another facility was built in Morris, Illinois, but it never operated on a production scale. And there was a third facility initiated in South Carolina, but that effort ended in about 1977. At the NRC, we saw a renewed interest in reprocessing in the mid-2000s, but that was much more limited than the interest that we've been seeing recently. Over the years, the NRC regulations have gone through a number of changes. And in response to that mid-2000s interest in reprocessing, in 2009, we issued some information and recognized by the agency that our regulations in Title 10 Code of Federal Regulations Part 50 that had been the framework for all of our prior reprocessing licensing history, that had become very light water nuclear reactor specific. So we proposed the idea of developing a reprocessing specific regulatory framework, but in large part due to the lack of potential commercial reprocessing applicants, we ended that effort several years ago. So our current licensing frameworks, our Part 50 licensing process, which is a two-step licensing process, a construction permit followed by a second application for an operating license, that can still be used for a future reprocessing facility. With the recognition that the NRC would need to adapt our requirements to be sure that we've covered all of the safety requirements for a reprocessing facility. An example of where our Part 50 regulations are not a perfect fit is that, our reactor regulations are premised on the hazards that are associated with reactor fuel assemblies. but not really for the industrial processes and reprocessing, which result in having radioactive material in other forms. We also have specific regulatory processes for licensing fuel cycle facilities in Title 10 Code of Federal Regulations, Part 70. This framework, which is a one-step licensing process, has requirements for fuel processing, which include things like the criticality controls for radioactive materials in forms other than the solid pellets of a fuel assembly. A future reprocessing application could choose to apply for a license at the NRC under the requirements of Part 70 as well. And much like an application under Part 50, the agency would still need to adapt those requirements to really ensure that we've addressed all of the requirements of reprocessing. As of today, we do not have any reprocessing applications in-house at the NRC, but we are ready to perform the safety review whenever an application is received. And I'm really happy to answer any questions on our licensing processes and timeframes.
All right, wonderful. I know that is definitely a question for local governments and communities about the length of time that these things take to become operational. And then, of course, the flip side, which is a very important aspect, is being able to communicate the safety and ensure that operations are conducted in accordance with their permit requirements and the regulations that we have in place. Thank you so much. After listening to this, I'm looking at some things that I know that we want to talk about during this webinar, and I'd like to kind of look at the technology discussion. The technology that exists. I mean, Dr. Schaefer pointed out that we have technologies that are developed, and there might be other reasons why we're not moving forward with those technologies and whatnot. But what I would like to know from Dr. Schaefer is what are the technologies that exist to reprocess spent nuclear fuel?
Right. So I'll focus on the separations technology, but one thing that I'd flag is that in a recycling facility, a reprocessing facility, you have numerous unit operations, right, that operate in concert with each other. And so there's lots of different ways that you can accomplish those individual operations. But on the separation process itself, the most conventional one that folks have a tendency to use is the aqueous or solvent extraction-based processing. This is the Purex process. There's been multiple other approaches to solvent extraction that have been considered, or modifications of the Purex process, used in present day, but that's basically the most common one. People have also considered pyroprocessing or molten salt electrochemistry, basically, and there's certainly precedent for us using this throughout the DOE complex in a lot of different ways. Limited deployment and implementation with respect to commercial applications, but it's something that I think that, as we've re-examined what the art of the possible could be, especially as you're considering potentially deploying fast spectrum reactors such as the type that Oklo and others are considering, it becomes an increasingly more viable opportunity. Another technology is halide volatility type technologies, and so this can be a volatility-based separation, so basically where you take your solid and, in a way, evaporate it if you want to use that. Complex it with things like fluorine or chlorine, or fluoride or chloride, I should really say. And then you basically are able to separate the actinides from that, leaving a lot of the fission products behind. And so those are some of the core approaches. There's other, more emergent technologies. So you could think about things like zone refining. This is something that's used significantly in the semiconductor industry. It's something that RP has funded previously. And I'll go ahead and say, at least for those three that I've mentioned, as I discussed a little bit, these are things that we have considered in the past as a government, over the course of decades, but there are things that when we look at them, for example, with pyroprocessing-based technologies, we know that the dissolution of oxide fuels is a challenge for them. They have a tendency to corrode the anodes pretty quickly, and so could you look at other anode-based technologies that could have more resistance, be more robust to management of that? When you look at fluoride-based or halide-based volatility approaches? Could you look at fluorinating agents that are maybe more selective, less aggressive, easier to manage, things of that nature? Solvent extraction, even though I commented on that, it's been kind of the gold standard, and there have been some challenges with the economics. I think there's lots of window of opportunity for optimizing there and changing either chemistries that could improve the waste management profile and cost, or just the efficiency of some of the separations processes. And so, again, could talk about this for a while, but hopefully that gives people a little bit of a flavor for the different technologies that are potentially at play.
Awesome. So when we're
Can I before you go forward, can I comment on that? Just
yeah,
one
actually, I was
thing?
going to ask you a question. Go,
Okay.
absolutely.
Well, I mean, I just wanted to add, I think, that we have over the last 80 years considered a lot of options
Yeah.
for separations, and they often are really aligned with the end use and thinking about how you provide a particular fuel source or a particular reactor type. But there are a lot of cross-cutting capabilities that have been developed in that process that are applicable to every fuel cycle facility. And thinking about safety of operations, how do we assure that the hazardous materials stay in the place where they're supposed to be? The tools that we have available to support analysis of those challenges and the underlying data that helps us build confidence in those analyses from experiments. Those are all applicable across many of these many of the potential design concepts for a fuel cycle facility. We also worry about radiation protection because we have radioactive materials, and how do we provide for adequate shielding for the personnel of that work in the facility, and that's common to all nuclear facilities. And then finally, probably the biggest safety challenge for fuel cycle facilities is assuring that we provide for criticality safety and don't have a reactor-like operation occur in a place where it shouldn't. In 80 years, we've developed a very robust program in the United States that develops those tools and capabilities and expertise and establishes review panels that is applicable to any fuel cycle facility we might deploy. So there's a lot of existing R&D that's been completed that we continue to improve that supports the deployment of any of these options that Jen has talked about.
I think that's a great point, especially to the way of, so many of these things the labs have worked at and not had the opportunity to really implement it at the scale that I think would be, really prove them out. And so there's certainly a lot of that in it.
So this is a little bit related to a new nuclear conference that we had a couple of years ago, where we were talking about the multiple technologies and the supply chain. And I'm wondering, what is your opinion about really honing in on specific technologies so that we can, again, be creative in the way we co-locate if we're supporting, the supply chain aspect and the operations, so like Manhattan Project, right? You're spreading it out because, you want to not put everything in one place because of security reasons, whatever, but now we're looking at things where we're looking at the opportunities and the efficiencies and the economies of scale of co-location. Mm-hmm. So how does that, what's your opinion on the multiple technologies that exist and potentially the multiple feedstocks that do exist? And how do we start to narrow those things down?
Exactly. Well, so I think you really hit some of the key challenges in your question. As we find ourselves in this exciting time, and there's a transition from conceptual development and proof of principle testing to real in the field deployment. The biggest questions for a community that's going to host a facility, or for the company that's proposing to build the facility themselves, really are about the viability of long-term operations and the economics of any of these proposed solutions. Certainly, if you look at the demand side, as I already talked about, there's this expectation of a demand curve that provides an incentive to find an economic solution. but there are a lot of open questions, and these are questions that we in the national labs and research communities really can't help industry answer, because we need to engage the business acumen and business experience um, of the companies that are going to pursue these facilities, and we need to engage people like Randy who have real policy and community policy experience, and understanding how we integrate um, these uh, these facilities into the workforce of the community and into the environment, the emergency protection environment of the community, and every aspect of life in these places. Um, and we have to find ways to bring the experience of people like Michelle to the table, so that we think about how all these things intersect to impact the cost of operations and producing the fuel that comes out of the backside of a recycling facility that's co-located. Certainly co-location is very attractive for a lot of reasons. You reduce the challenges of the transportation. Randy mentioned the opportunity to build internal transportation systems, and to reduce the regulatory burden of interstate transport. Um, and so, those are certainly opportunities to have an impact on the cost, the daily cost of operations. The last thing that you mentioned, the supply chain, is really I think the critical indicator for understanding the maturity of a commercial plant. And has do we have confidence that we have aligned a supply chain globally or within the U.S. that can actually provide all the components that are necessary for a facility to operate.
That
And
seems to be like the main thing that people
that's the
bring up
that's the
when we talk
main
about
that's really the main challenge as we go forward. In the laboratories, when we build a facility, we're asking a company to build something they have never made before,
it.
and
Right.
we're giving them some leeway. If it doesn't work, there's not going to be any penalty for you, because we're asking you to do something nobody's ever done before. Um, but when you transition to commercial operations, that's no longer really a viable path, right? And so, building that confidence in our supply chain capability is really important at this point in time.
No, I think that those are all great things to keep in mind. And what I would say too is when it comes to down selection, or especially if communities are in the position of they're trying to identify what technology makes sense for them, certainly the technology is one key piece of it. Another piece of it is, what is the broader business strategy? How are people thinking about how their technology intersects with fuels that might be available for handling? How does the company think about where they're redeploying the fuel that they fabricate into reactors, right? And for some of those reasons, I'm actually sometimes hesitant to use the term down selection. I realize that communities are in the position that if they're thinking about this, they might be thinking at this time about who is a company that they're most interested in engaging with. But I think one of the challenges that we've had is almost too frequently we're quick to want to try and down select to a technology and not see how these technologies interact with the broader market and understand how those intersections occur. And so my bit of encouragement would be, as you're doing your evaluations, think about how these technologies play in the broader national landscape. And the reality is, I actually think that multiples of these technologies can make sense, especially
Mhm.
since we actually don't know what our reactors strategy will look like come 2050. We're talking about tripling or quadrupling nuclear, and we don't know if that's going to be another 200 AP1000s or if that's going to be, a handful of AP1000s, some natrium reactors, right? And all of these things have an interdependence with them. And so, there's a saying basically, steady is slow, slow is fast. Keep all of these interdependencies in mind as you're working through the national landscape with the fuel cycle.
Yeah, and if you look at existing facilities globally, they certainly align with the environment that they're there to serve, right? I mean,
Right.
the operations at Sellafield are aligned with the Magnox operations in the UK, and
Hmm.
the operations of La Hague are aligned with the French fleet. And so, we have to expect that there's that opportunity for multiple fuel cycle facilities to align um, with the diversity of advanced reactors that we're seeing pursued at this point in time.
Yeah. All right. So sticking with co-location, the size of a site for spent fuel storage and reprocessing, and let's say you have other operations, like so from Piketon, we have centrifuge enrichment activities. We have depleted uranium hexafluoride conversion activities. So we have all the tails, the DO6 tails. If we, and Oklo, I forgot about Oklo's purchasing property, planning to build a nuclear reactor. So when we have these multiple things existing, let's say you bring in a spent fuel storage, and then you also co-locate the reprocessing there. What kind of a footprint? And this might be a good question for Michelle too, from a regulatory standpoint. What kind of a footprint is required when all of those operations are occurring in the same general location? You know, is 3,000 acres enough? Should it be 10,000 acres? You know, what kind of footprint are we looking at?
Well, I can touch on that just, from our experience with spent fuel storage that's co-located at the operating plants in the U.S. today. Generally speaking, plants have had plenty of space to co-locate the spent fuel storage dry gas systems within their existing footprint. It's relatively a small amount of area that's required for that. With additional industrial processes like a reprocessing facility, it would clearly require its own amount of space, but, having a little bit of familiarity with the gaseous diffusion plants, the size of the facilities in Oak Ridge. I mean, those DOE sites are so much larger than an operating nuclear power reactor facility. You could probably cite multiple facilities on that size of a site. So I think, the space requirements are not negligible, but they're not enormous.
Yeah, if you look at the operating plants at the operating facilities in Europe at Sellafield and La Hague, the largest footprint aspect of those plants is really fuel storage, and use fuel pools where they're actively cooling, fuel that has been relocated there from reactors. And so, if we think about co-locating a facility, we're really taking advantage of space that we're already committing to storage to fill that need. And the additional space associated with fuel cycle facilities is not necessarily as large as you might think. If we go back to the Manhattan Project era and we're building gaseous diffusion plants like we had here in Piketon, or had at Piketon, or here at Oak Ridge, then those are enormous facilities. But we don't really have that same footprint requirement with modern enrichment or conversion facilities, and aren't going to see those same kind of large scale facility development requirements. That said, everybody's very concerned about the scale up of our capabilities, and in fuel cycle facilities, we're often very limited by that criticality safety challenge that I mentioned earlier. You can only have so much material in one place before you create a risk that you could create a critical volume. And so we tend to build facilities that are small and and then in order to scale up our production, we build more of them in parallel. Instead of essentially instead of operating one plant, you're operating 4 in one or more, depending on what kind of volume you're trying to produce. And so, as companies are looking for space, they're really keeping that in mind. I want to make sure, I don't know what the future looks like. I want to make sure I have the option to expand. And that certainly drives a lot of the very aggressive asks for large acreage that we're currently seeing.
I would add to that, if I could, that we've seen asks that went from 40 acres to 1,000 acres. The Oklo facility is, somewhere in that 350 acre range.
Mm-hmm.
But they have varied pretty widely, and I think there are a couple of things that drive that. One is the protective boundaries, and the other is people once they locate, they've gone through the NRC process. They really want to have a facility where they can expand. So,
Mhm.
Radiant for us, which is, a microreactor company, they're on about 60, 70 acres. Oklo wanted 350. You get into what you've got in Portsmouth, Jennifer. You could be looking at folks that want 1,000 acres. So they have
Yeah.
very widely, but anybody that's on this webinar that's talking to companies, I would encourage you to have real conversations and to let folks really, they'll come in, they'll want land, but let them do some planning and have a conversation, because ultimately the ones that co-locate, they want to leave enough room for the rest of the businesses that they're going to benefit from to be in adjacency. So they're going to have some, possibly large expectations at first. And a lot of times we've seen those get honed down into something that's much more realistic, because they realize we're part of a co-location of several companies, and we want to exist with them.
Yeah, I think that's all very well said. And just Le Hague in France is about 750 acres. Rakasho, Japan is about 1,000 acres. And Rakasho, you have a lot of co-location going on there. You've got the reprocessing, the enrichment, the fuel fab, the waste storage and
Everything.
monitoring, right? So yeah, you could imagine people further optimizing that, but much consistent with the numbers that Randy was providing.
Yeah. Very good. We do have a question that came in on the chat about the jobs. So let's talk a little bit about how communities benefit from these types of projects. And so let's compare number of jobs for a reprocessing facility in the different ranges that there might be, and then, compared to maybe just spent fuel storage. Does anybody have the information on that? Maybe Randy has looked at that in dealing with these companies. From the community's perspective, that seems to be the first question: is how many jobs, right?
Sure. A lot of them are in that anywhere from 200 to 400 job range is what we see. There's some obviously larger, and it just depends on what it is, and several smaller as well. But we look at job creation, but we also look at the tax base that would be generated, understanding that there's much more automation going on now, and that it's going to be different than it was, as David pointed out, back when you had the K25 gaseous diffusion plant and you had 1 million acres under roof. We're not going to see that anymore. So, we hope for jobs, but that's not the only thing that we look at when we evaluate.
Yeah.
Well, and I think there's also a difference in just the environment of the way work is done, and it's also difficult to quantify the impact of a single facility on jobs, because so much of the work is done by contract, and or by suppliers as part of the supply chain, and it's very difficult to unravel that ball of twine that you create. But it does create opportunities, for people that have very special sets of skills, that align with STEM education and training, in community colleges, that create good, solid, well-paying jobs for people that have some technical capability, and are able to support, the important work and instrumentation and control, and metrology, and being able to make measurements in the facility, and the maintenance and reliability of equipment, and just the day-to-day construction and craft operations of a facility of this scale, that have far-reaching impacts in the community. And so it's not just the number of jobs you're creating, but it's also the quality and type of job that you're creating
Absolutely.
as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, from what I've seen for Ricasho and La Hague, I believe the jobs are on the order of thousands, right? And these are national scale facilities, right? And so, depending on the type and size of scale of facility that is being considered for communities, it's certainly possible that that's ultimately what those could reach to. And then you start talking about, other economic, downstream effects. It's people have cited, up to on the order of 10,000 jobs basically that are as a side effect of the direct. So that's at least how it sets up in other countries about.
Yeah. 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 Those indirect jobs, they, when you start to do those calculations, it becomes pretty surprising. Like there really is a significant impact.
Mhm.
The ripple effect is just incredible. Let's see. I did want to ask, just in relation to timing. So, like, if we're preparing for, becoming a site that stores spent fuel and does the reprocessing, what is the timeline for that permitting for the reprocessing facility, Michelle? What's the, they select their site and then they put in an application. What's that schedule look like?
Sure. So I mentioned we do have two different sort of regulatory frameworks, a one-step licensing or a two-step licensing. But generally speaking, regardless of which path the applicant would take, from the time that we receive the completed application, that has all of the information we need to review, we would expect to finish our licensing review in about 18 months. And that would give the authority for constructing the plant. And if it's under our Part 71 step process, it would give the authority to construct the plant. And then there would probably be a hold point where we would sort of confirm, inspections and all the operations had construction was done correctly before the plant would start operating. If it's our two-step process, once as construction is completing, there would actually be a second application for the operating license. And that review would take an amount of time. Usually it runs in parallel with finalizing construction. And then once construction's done, we can issue that operating license. But it does have that additional second step that can add another 6 months to a year at the end of construction.
Okay. Very good. We're getting close. See, it's 2:52. I'm not seeing, see if we've got any questions coming in. Let's talk about, I'm going to bring Randy back in just because I'm local government. This is my interest, Energy Communities Alliance, this, helping the local governments kind of navigate through this process. But, so Oak Ridge has the large footprint, multiple operations occurring within this footprint. So the economic impact, we talked about this, it alluded to this, that it's not necessarily the number of jobs, but the quality of jobs, and that is 100% accurate. But the overall economic impact to the host community and the region, what can a community expect that to be from, a full-scale operation of a closed loop fuel cycle?
We expect obviously for it to be fruitful, but on the other hand, I would encourage communities to really think through the cost of service that's associated with what we're talking about here. If you haven't thought through it, I mean, there's a cost associated with making sure that every fire person in your fire department has hazmat training that's
Right.
appropriate. There's a cost associated with, we're going to have a fleet of LPRs, license plate readers, that surround this facility. There's a cost associated with, we really ought to have an armored vehicle placed out next to these private entities because they're not behind the blue line of the lab or Y12 anymore. And how do we deal with emergencies if you asked me what keeps me up at night, I would tell you that it would be the idea of terrorist activities and things that a 60-person, police department would struggle with. So we're gonna have to work as a region to help solve those things. And from a tax base standpoint, I know folks see numbers and they think, oh, 5 billion of investment, but there's not. The general public doesn't understand that there's a lot of cost associated with that too. We view it as a very long-term strategy, and that's why we are trying to model it. That's why we're proud that ECA gave us a grant that we're going to try to figure out what is the additional cost to fire service. We're going to try to pencil that with a grant so that we can then put those costs into the model and actually produce something that we can share that actually explains the benefits and the cost. Because most people just look at it and think, oh, Oak Ridge will be wealthy in the future. Well, that's not the case. There's a lot of costs associated with what's going on here in infrastructure and continued service.
Yeah, that's such a great point. That with every opportunity, there are costs associated with that. Sometimes it's the opportunity cost of selecting one technology or one pathway that then eliminates other opportunities. So those are things that everyone really does need to consider when you're in those community positions. Let's see. We do have a question from one of our participants here. Why is the pyro process not advanced? Anode oxidation is a consideration, but elimination of high water volumes should be a major advantage. Why isn't pyro progressing?
Yeah,
like
I can.
Or Dr. Pointer, one of you.
Yeah, I mean, what I would say about that is this is something that I think you are starting to see this progressing, right? Now, these are technologies, companies like Oklo, right? The bedrock of what they're considering is pyro-based processing. I mean, one of the challenges that you do have with pyro, and this is potentially resolvable, but generally with aqueous recycling, it is easier to generate high quality products. You have multiple separation stages. And as a consequence of that, you are able to much more readily manage what byproducts that you can get in those streams, right? Having said that, right, all of those separation stages come with waste management implications and capital costs that are associated with them. And so it's something that is a bit of a limitation for pyro, but these are also things that folks are considering. And I'll also say that if you're running a fast spectrum reactor, right, the cross contamination of minor actinides into that stream becomes much less problematic. It's much more important for light water reactors. So those are some considerations off the top of my head. David, I don't know if you had anything to.
No, I think that you hit the real challenge right on the head, right? I mean, it's the absence of a reactor community, that is aligned with the end product, where you do have actinides that are integral as part of the output stream. It has been the hurdle. We haven't seen them built because we haven't been able to make use of what comes out the back end of a pyro process. And with the evolution of fast spectrum systems and the efforts to build the TerraPower concept, the Atrium concept in Wyoming, and the efforts of Oklo to deploy a small modular fast spectrum reactor, as well as the development of molten salt reactor technologies, that all align with the output of a pyro process, it becomes more viable. And that's why we're seeing sudden industrial interest in really deploying facilities.
Very good. Well, it looks like we have 1 minute left, so we need to wrap this up. And I want to say again, thank you to DOE Office of Nuclear Energy for supporting this webinar series. And we have several other questions that have come in that will be looked at, and we'll be responding to those and also using those to help us come up with additional webinars that can help inform communities and industry experts and others on, where we might be going with these with nuclear energy. New nuclear is very exciting, and so with that, any last words from our panelists?
I'll just say
This was
that.
helpful.
Yeah.
But I'll just say that there are good examples of these fuel cycle facilities that exist within the national laboratories, and we're certainly eager to help communities across the country who want to see what a real fuel cycle facility looks like to get into one, and so take advantage of that resource.
Awesome.
I'll echo what David said, and we ask questions of the labs. We want to know when you come in with a new process, where was it tested? Oklo's working with Idaho. We have companies that are working with our lab. We depend upon knowledge from the labs when we make decisions about how do we diversify our portfolio of businesses so that we have a little bit of each sector, quite frankly.
All right. Thank you all so much. I hope that we get to do this again soon.
Thank you.
Appreciate every one of you. Thank you to all the participants.
Thank you, Jennifer. Well done.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.